Good afternoon. I'm Arnie Eisen, the Chancellor of JTS, and it's my honor to welcome you, and especially Stan and Adina and Judith and Merle and Toby and the rest of Paula's family, to JTS for the celebration of Paula's life and this marking of what Paula meant to us. I'm pleased that we're able to gather for this purpose at JTS. The fact that Paula taught here and served as dean here and fought to change JTS and conservative Judaism and the Jewish community from within this base of 3080 Broadway is one of the things that makes me proud to be associated with JTS. Paula had a big impact here. I had hoped to get Paula involved closely with JTS again when I became chancellor, but other obligations and the return of the cancer got in the way. That makes me all the happier that so many friends and colleagues of Paula's from so many chapters of her life and so many spheres of her activity are here with us today. I want to thank Ann Lerner, Aryeh Davidson, and others inside and outside JTS, especially my assistant Michelle, for organizing this event. And I want to thank my friend and colleague David Ellenson, who responded with alacrity to the request that HUC co-sponsor today's gathering. Let me say, too, that I'm glad we could go ahead despite the devastation left in the wake of the storm, the many deaths it caused, and the suffering that continues. I hope the memories we share of one of the truly good people we have known in our lives, good with a capital G, will help inspire us all to do good in the days and weeks to come. I've been thinking, in preparation for these remarks, about my friendship with Paula and how intertwined it was with our professional relationship, and how it went beyond that relationship, and so made my career as a scholar and a teacher much more meaningful and satisfying than it would have been otherwise. It goes without saying, and therefore should not go without saying, what a difference Paula made to young women in the classroom and the field. My wife, Ace, is one of them. She remembers the young Paula Hyman, whose class she took in the late 70s, as a professor of exceptional clarity and passion, one of the few women she had as her history professor, and how much it meant to have Paula as both teacher and role model. It may be less obvious, but no less true, that men of my generation were also figuring out new ways of being men during those years, assisted mightily in that task by good female friends such as Paula. And scholars of my age and inclination were figuring out how to practice the new field of Jewish studies in the university. We wanted to pioneer the application of emerging fields to Judaism, as Paula did with social history and women's history, and we wanted to express our Jewish commitments while being caring teachers and excellent scholars, using scholarship and Jewishness to enrich rather than limit one another. In this, too, we were assisted greatly by friends and models such as Paula. I first met Paula in my graduate school and young professor years. She and Deborah Dashmore published my first book in the series they edited for Indiana. Paula, as much as anyone, helped me find a voice as a Jew, a Jewish scholar, and a Jewish male with which I was comfortable. This happened in part by reading her work. I marveled at the sweep, detail, and sheer intelligence of From Dreyfus to Vichy, which came out in 1979, a year after I finished my dissertation on American Judaism, and just before I started revising it for publication. But I think I was also influenced by things like the thanks given in the preface to Stan, who, quote, collaborated in the daily chores which prove such a distraction from work and listened patiently to endless discussions of French Jewry, end quote. Judith and Adina are thanked for providing, quote, much diversion when it was needed and when it was not, as well as proper perspective. I read through the Jewish Woman in America again for today's gathering. I think that what most impressed me was how honest, smart, and tough the book is. The final chapter, From Veneration to Vituperation, Jewish Women Today, today being 1975, is remarkable. The treatments of the Jewish mother and Jewish American princess stereotypes are still relevant and, in my view, not at all dated. The stereotypes are alive and well. I want to read the final paragraph, which is typical of the quality and tone of the entire book, I think. The experience of Jewish women in America has sometimes been idiosyncratic and sometimes similar to that of other women moving through social, political, and economic change. Emigration and shifts of power often rupture cultural value systems in such a way that women find their identities out of phase with received standards. Economic development also affects female roles and the images of women derived from their roles. American Jewish women have not been alone in their struggle with the problems arising from such changes, and their behavior has many parallels with that of women in like situations. In this sense, their story not only belongs to the chronicle of American Jewry, but also forms an important chapter in the history of women. Again, though, as good as the book is, I enjoyed the preface just as much, particularly the brief bios of the three authors, presumably written by each one of them, but presented in third person. Paula chose to tell us not only that she, quote, teaches Jewish history on the college level, but that she is a member of the New York Chavurah and, quote, helped found Ezrat Nashim, the first feminist organization actively pressing for improvement of the status of women within the Jewish community. For Paula, Paula says, the sense of otherness she first felt at Radcliffe, quote, was a special quality she never wishes to deny. Nor should we, I think. I never experienced Paula as typical. She was special. Her rock-bottom integrity, never to be doubted, is not something I have found in many people. Her powerful intellect, amazing good sense, total seriousness, even when laughing, as she often did, in that unique way we can all hear and see in our minds right now, her amazing honesty, the genuine interest she took in her friends, all of these were far from typical. Ace tells me that whenever Paula called to speak with me, and Ace answered the phone, Paula did not rush through pro forma chit-chat with Ace on the way to getting me on the phone, though I was the closer friend and colleague and the object of the call. This was true even when she was not feeling good. If Paula was ever in a hurry to get past a request or business call from me, she never let on. I doubt she was. She seemed deliberate in all things. You always knew where you stood with Paula, and if you were lucky enough to stand closer to her, you knew you were standing in the right place. Paula validated my path in more ways than I can name. As a friend, as a man, as a male friend of a strong woman, as a scholar who insists on rigor but brings passion to the task, as a Zionist, critical of Israel but in love with Israel, as a thoughtful and committed Jew, as a human being who's learned never to put off telling my friends I love them, lest it come too late. I loved Paula for so many things. I still find it hard to believe we're remembering her right now, almost 11 months after losing her, instead of listening to that unique voice of hers and trying to be worthy of it. I want to thank you all for being here today to share this afternoon of Thanksgiving for Paula. I'm now turned to Paula's close friend, my good friend, the president of HUC, David Ellenson.
Thank you, Arnie. This is one of those moments where, in fact, the Chancellor has virtually said it all, but in this case, I and others have not yet said it. In light of Arnie's remarks, one thing that I would like to do at this moment, how many people who are in this room now were members of Ezrat Nashim with Paula? Would you raise your hand? It's pretty remarkable. And how many people here were members of the New York Chavurah? There you go. Yes, Judith and Adina, you should raise your hands. It's not an insignificant fact that I'm not going to just say you, but I'll say us are here today. In 1973, my friend Jerry Serrata invited me to become a member of the New York Chavurah, and it was there that I first was introduced to Paula. I think as I wrote in Lilith magazine in an article in memory of Paula, I remember her walking in the room. I think she had just finished her dissertation, and she was just been appointed then as an assistant professor of history at Columbia. And she had this golden blonde hair, wonderful smile, and everyone had really crowded around her to wish her a mazel tov. And in Paula's inimitable style, and looking at her daughters, her sisters, and her husband, her usual bashful way that made it so difficult for her, as it were, to go forward and say what was on her mind or to meet people. She came up, introduced herself to me, and we began a friendship. Shortly thereafter, you all were still living then, Stan, uptown while you were doing your residency and internship at Columbia. We had dinner at your home. Judith, you were a little baby. Adina, you were not yet born at that time, and soon you moved down to 113th Street. And it, I guess, seemed that at least 4 to 5 days a week, I was with my daughter Ruthie and with Judith, Adina, and Paula virtually every day. And then on the other days, although sometimes they were with us, Phyllis Sperling with Sharon was there together, and it really began a lifelong friendship. I think, as Arnie put it, it is hard to know with Paula where the personal and the professional separated from one another. In fact, there really was no distinction. She and I spoke incessantly for many decades, and we became really the best of friends. As I mentioned at the funeral, I remember very much when your mother, your wife, first had cancer, sitting with her in the hospital at Columbia Presbyterian, and the courage and determination that she displayed during that point, and the will she had to continue to live. Her gratitude to you, Dr. Shorish, was very overwhelming. I know that you played a major role in her coming, you played the major role. You were responsible for her coming to the seminary, and she was always grateful to you for that and for all the support that you provided her throughout her academic career and her life, as well as personally. When Jackie and I were married in 1982, and this was a story that I've told on Paula on several occasions, Jackie and I each decided when our ketubah would be signed that we would each have our best friend as witness. Jackie selected one of her friends, and of course at my wedding, Paula held the chuppah, and I asked Paula if she would be the signator for my ketubah. This is something that could go in the Jewish Women's Archives. I know that Gail and Judith are here. Paula's initial response was to say, well, you know, I've never really done this, and if I sign your ketubah, it's not going to be halakhically valid. And by that point already, I had said, well, that is true, but if you actually look at the ketubah that Jackie and I have designed itself, it's pretty egalitarian and not especially halakhically valid as it is. And in addition, I've crossed that river a long time ago. If, on the other hand, you feel uncomfortable, you really should not sign this, but if you would feel sufficiently comfortable, I would be honored. And this is a decade after Ezrat Nashim. It just demonstrates, when I think back 30 years, how difficult it was for people to change the roles into which they had been socialized as men and women in our culture. I am very pleased to say that Paula did sign our ketubah. Over the years, I regret to say that that signature faded. And Jackie and I had always talked about having Paula re-sign it. And I was always very sorry. And now it's really too late to have her do that. I remember very, very vividly when she made the decision to go to Yale. Any number of us were completely opposed. We thought it was a terrible decision for her to make. After all, Stan was being uprooted, and as Judith pointed out in a beautiful article that she had written earlier this year, there were a lot of men who would not have left a tenured position at Columbia University to go to Yale for what was initially a non-tenured position. But Stan was always incredibly encouraging of Paula in that way. And Paula felt that if she had not accepted that position, that it would have been tantamount to saying, this was after a couple more bouts with cancer, that she was not going to continue to live. And so she went to Yale, where she taught and led all of us for more than 25 years. Two stories that I've told on other occasions, but I would mention here because they reflect so much on who Paula was as a person. Once she was on the Judges Committee for the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, and Rachel Adler was actually a person who had applied for a fellowship. A couple of people who were on the committee, men, what are you going to do, men? Opposed giving it to Rachel, saying that her background in Talmudic studies wasn't sufficient to allow her to write the book that eventually became Engendering Judaism. Paula told me that she was furious at this, and that she insisted that the fellowship be given to Rachel, and in fact it was. Years later, too, I remember that a college classmate of mine, John Boswell, who was a very distinguished historian at Yale, when he passed away, one of her colleagues at Yale delivered the eulogy. John was a gay man, and he was, in quotes, out, and a very, very significant role model to countless numbers of students, faculty, and other GLBT people at Yale and elsewhere. And Paula felt that it was horrible that in eulogizing him, this colleague had not mentioned the fact that he was gay at all. For Paula, it was a sense of attempting to present the wholeness of who this person was and what this person meant. And for her, it was, as it were, a sort of mortal sin that her colleague had not mentioned this. But again, I think it reflects her character. As Arnie pointed out, our relationship focused, I think, in many of the same areas with many of the same topics that Arnie mentioned. But I would like to say that for me, on a personal level, her writings, both in the Jewish Woman book that Liz Colton edited, where Paula had written an article back in 1975, and especially in her book, Gender and Assimilation, which were the Strom lectures at the University of Washington, Paula had an immense influence on many, many people's scholarship, both men and women. Two things that Paula pointed out to me that appear so obvious that I cannot believe I did not think of these things earlier on my own. Occasionally you read something and you think, Pshita, yes, that's exactly what I think. But the fact is, until she put the words down on paper, I had not thought about it quite so consciously. One was that the classical failure of Jewish religious tradition to allow women access to the study of Jewish text actually had a strong political implication. As she pointed out in the 1975 article, Judaism assigned, and now I'm paraphrasing Paula, she didn't put it this way precisely, but Judaism assigned positions of status and power, as many patriarchal cultures do, virtually exclusively to men. And they assigned positions of what I'm going to call, these are my words, not Paula's, domestic honor to women. What that meant was that in the two areas that counted the most in Jewish life, the area of prayer and the area of study, women really could not express their voices in public, that there were significant political implications in terms of power relations in the community by the fact that women were not able to engage in these two areas. And a number of articles that I've written in my own career, writings of the chief rabbis of Israel on issues of the extension of suffrage to women in the public arena in the state of Israel, an article on a Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin on extending the privilege to women of studying oral law, not only written law, the article in the Feshrift that Deborah and Marion labored on so lovingly for Paula on writings of 19th century German Orthodox rabbis. I always get back to them at some point. That allowed women the privilege of being able to begin to study oral texts, Torah Sheba'al Peh within Jewish tradition, that the implications of that for the empowerment of women in our religious tradition represent chapters that are still unfolding in Jewish public life. The other area was when Deborah and Paula edited their book on the Jewish women in America. I was privileged to be asked to write an article on Zionism. And in her book, Gender and Assimilation, Paula pointed out, too, that one of the factors about the role of women, particularly in contemporaneous Jewish culture, that had a transformative effect on Jewish life was that issues of domestic concern that had formerly been simply private areas had been transformed into areas of public concern. And in that article, when I looked at groups like Hadassah, the National Council of Jewish Women, Mizrahi women, what these women were able to do was to take issues like health care, child care leave, and areas of this type, feeding of children and others, and they were able to make these into issues of public policy concern within the Jewish world, so that Paula's impact on my writings and my concerns academically, in addition to our personal relationship, is something that stays with me, and I think with countless numbers of other people to this day. When I look around this room, and I know the relationships that so many of you enjoyed with Paula, this is certainly the most bittersweet of days, and to look at you especially, Adina and Judith, and to see what lovely women you've grown up to be. I'm not your father, but I am like your uncle. I love, when we honored Paula at the AJS a couple of years ago, I went out to dinner, and it was during Hanukkah, and I gave Judith's twins some guilt, or Judith's husband told me later that the twins said, "Now, who was that guy with the beard and the bald head?" They said, "Is he an uncle?" And Judith said, "Yeah, that's one way to look at him." I have many memories of this type as I think about Paula and as we recall her on this day, and contributions that she made to so many of our lives and the personal relationships we enjoy. I can't help but think again of the words of Shir HaShirim, where it says that God dovev siftei yeshenim, that God moves gently the lips of those who sleep. And Chazal, the rabbis, in commenting upon it, say that what does it mean that God moves gently? The words of those who sleep, the lips of those who sleep, that even from the grave, even in their death, dovev siftotav min hakever, that God continues to move those lips from the place of their eternal rest to give us ongoing memory, instruction, and guidance. And on this day, it is a privilege to think of Paula and all that she has meant to so many of us, and the contributions that she continues to make. In this spirit, then, I think we will be talking about those contributions this afternoon. It is a great, great privilege to call Beth and Judith, Beth Wanger and Judith Plaskow, up here. Beth is professor of Jewish history at the University of Pennsylvania, a foremost student of American Jewish history. She was Paula's student here at JTS. She followed Paula to Yale, where she completed her doctorate. Paula loved Beth very, very much and took great, great pride in all that you would accomplish. Judith, all of our times go back to the New York Havurah together, a graduate of Clark. She received her doctorate also at Yale, not Columbia, but it's okay. At Yale as well, and certainly foremost Jewish feminist theologian of our day. So Beth and Judith, it's yours.
I've been asked to reflect this afternoon on Paula as a scholar activist and an activist scholar. And I was thinking about how to frame what I want to say, given that everybody in this room is familiar with and has been affected by Paula's activism, and many people here have been activists alongside her. So the first thing I did was to go back and reread Paula's introduction to the memoirs of Paula Rakowski, the 19th century, 19th and through the middle of the 20th century, Polish Jewish feminist whose work Paula discovered and then brought to light. And I was struck, first of all, that finding a publisher and helping to translate this memoir from the Yiddish so that her students and a wider public could have material from women's hands is already an important example of Paula's activism. But I was also really struck on reading the introduction by how Paula could have been describing herself. She talks about Paula Rakowski as someone who recognized the significance of women's subordination in the private as well as the public domains, and who didn't differentiate between those domains in her radicalism. And Arnie and David have already spoken about the seamlessness of Paula's personal and academic and activist lives. Paula says of Paula Rakowski that the strands of her radicalism were meshed in her feminism, and certainly that's true of Paula. Rakowski was committed throughout her life to separate women's organizations that placed women's concerns at the center of activity, and I think immediately of Ezrat Nashim and its importance in Paula's life. Rakowski preached a message of female self-empowerment and the need for women of privilege who had a voice to take responsibility for affecting social change. And then Paula also quotes the American Yiddish poet Jacob Gladstein, who said of Paula Rakowski, when she was still in her 20s and the mother of 2 young children, she went out into the broad world to seek and find the way for Jewish women. And of course, that's exactly a description of Paula. I first met Paula in February of 1973 at the first National Jewish Feminist Conference at the McAlpin Hotel in New York City. I knew about her already because of Ezrat Nashim's trip to the Rabbinical Assembly the previous spring and their call for change. And also, just a few months before the conference, Paula had published an article that David mentioned entitled "The Other Half, Women in the Jewish Tradition," which was initially published in Conservative Judaism. The article began by talking about Ezrat Nashim and the reasons for discontent among educated Jewish women who experience a profound tension between their knowledge of Judaism and their inability or their limited ability to use that knowledge for the betterment of the Jewish community and to participate in Jewish public religious life. And the article is a passionate critique of the roles and status of women in Judaism and a powerful call for change. And along with Rachel Adler's early piece, The Jew Who Wasn't There. It really was one of the first feminist calls for change. In that article, Paula criticized sex role differentiation as the foundation of women's subordinate roles. And she said at this point, the apologists are going to trot out the great women of Sunday school text, Deborah, Huldah, and argue that women have always been able to play a leadership role in Judaism. Paula said, these are very frail shoulders on which to ground the argument that women could attain real authority in Judaism. And it's interesting to me, you can hear the future feminist historian speaking. She says, and I'm quoting her now, anecdotal references to singular women cannot substitute for much needed scholarly investigation of the various social and economic roles women have played at different moments of Jewish history. Until that scholarship bears fruit, we are left with mere token women, colorful and rare though they may be. Well, who has contributed more to this scholarship bearing fruit than Paula? She says, she ends the article by saying, what we're seeking is not more apologetics, but change, and that we cannot change until we acknowledge the problem. On the first day of that feminist conference, a question arose as to how to handle the davening on Shabbos. There were many Orthodox women at the conference. One of the exciting things about it was that it represented the spectrum of the Jewish community from very secular to Orthodox. And there were 400 women there, but there were many Orthodox women present who could not consider themselves a minyan even with a group of that size. And on the other hand, it was inconceivable to Ezrat Nashim that 400 women gathered together would not recite those parts of the service that are only said in a minyan. Well, a number of us stayed up really late into the night, ironing out a compromise, and Paula was one of those women. And we decided that the service would include Borhu, Kaddish, and that women could respond or not respond, depending on whether they saw themselves as counted or not counted. I'm pretty sure, people correct me if I'm wrong, that Paula read Torah at that conference, and that for most of the women present, it was the first time that they had heard a woman read Torah. It was very, very powerful. So my friendship with Paula started at that conference, and we really became friends and comrades in the struggle from that point on. Shortly after the conference, or maybe it was simultaneous, Paula began working with Charlotte Baum and Sonia Michel on the Jewish women in America. And I see this book, like the Rakowski memoir, as expressing Paula's activism. And she depicts the book in retrospect as coming out of her involvements in the feminist movement at Columbia, and her involvement in the beginning of Jewish feminism. This activism, she said, piqued her curiosity about the role of women in the past. But, and this is really interesting, she regarded the book as a digression from her serious work on French Jewry. So it was really a gift to the feminist movement coming out of her feminism. Not surprisingly, the book was seen the same way by her employers. And I'm trying to remember, I don't know whether Paula was still at Columbia or she was already at the seminary. She was being evaluated either for renewal or tenure the book was held against her. I remember a conversation about this. It was at Columbia. Okay, so it wasn't even that it didn't count. It was, the attitude was someone who had taken the time to write a popular book without footnotes couldn't possibly be a serious scholar. And did she have enough serious scholarship to compensate for the time that she spent writing this book? In retrospect, it's clear that Jewish Woman in America anticipates many of the themes that she took up in Gender and Assimilation. It had 20 pages of bibliography, including many archival sources, but it didn't have footnotes. Now, of course, Paula's feelings about her own work gradually changed as she realized the power of a gendered lens to reconfigure the field of Jewish history. And she says of herself that she became more and more eager to apply the exciting work that was being done in women's history to Jewish history. And so more and more she chose scholarly topics that were related to women. I think her article on the New York City kosher meat boycott of 1972 was really a breakthrough and a turning point in Paula's work in this regard. That article, first of all, brings a forgotten piece of history to the fore. In May of 1902, the price of kosher meat skyrocketed from 12 to 18 cents a pound. And immigrant women took to the streets. They formed committees, they called mass meetings, they rioted, they knocked on doors and organized neighbors. They asked neighbors to stop buying meat. And their activities were sufficiently significant to merit an angry editorial in the New York Times, calling for the quick repression of these ignorant foreign women who were trying to set fire to butcher shops. But the significance of this article went way beyond the recovery of a piece of women's history. It led Paula to redefine the nature of political activity. She pointed out that in focusing on the labor movement and on socialist parties, historians had overlooked the role of women, and they'd overlooked the neighborhood as a sphere of political action. Also, historians had tended to compartmentalize immigrants into Orthodox, socialist, anarchist, or Zionist, and the meat boycotts made Paula realize that this failed to do justice to the interplay among these groups. These women cared enough to buy kosher meat. They quoted the Bible in the course of their struggle. They used synagogues as organization sites. They got rabbis on their side to preach sermons about the meat, and yet they were highly politicized and fairly effective. So Paula argued in this piece that at the same time that we need to expand our notions of political activism to begin to see women's activities, looking at these activities shakes up our understanding of immigrant history. And this idea that a focus on women and gender enriches and complicates our understanding of modern Jewish history and of patterns of assimilation was the subject of Paula Strom lectures at the University of Washington, published as Gender and Assimilation. Here again, she pointed out that historical accounts of assimilation have focused on public behavior and on the writings of elite men. The experiences of women were different. Women had fewer opportunities for education, fewer opportunities for participation in public life, and thus displayed fewer signs of radical assimilation. women's assimilation occurred, but it occurred in a different framework. And she says we have to enter the home to appreciate these different patterns. So again, picking up on the theme that comes up in Pua Rakowski's memoir and Paula's introduction. Paula's work was striking for always maintaining a balance between the sheer pleasure of uncovering stories of women who'd been lost to history and the insistence that recovering these stories was not just a matter of adding women and stirring, but challenging fundamental paradigms in the field of history. Her two huge joint projects, the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women in America and the Jewish Women, a Historical Encyclopedia, offer a profusion of narratives that probably Paula could not have imagined in 1972 when she called for the investigation of the social and economic roles of women. And at the same time, she was always asking, what does this mean for our understanding of Jewish history? In 1999, Paula and Martha Ecclesberg and I spoke at a conference at Yale on Jewish women and freedom. And the same issue came up as had come up at the first National Jewish Women's Conference. How were the women going to pray together? And at this conference at Yale, the liberal women were very comfortable not counting themselves as a minion. They said, the battle has been won. You know we have equality. We don't have to worry anymore. Therefore, we can allow the Orthodox women to feel comfortable by not counting ourselves. Well, Paula, Martha, and I had a fit and argued passionately that counting women in a minyan was a fundamental religious principle. What does it mean to have won a victory, we said, and then be willing to surrender it? We have equality, so we don't need to have equality anymore. And it was a really interesting moment because we were sort of looking at ourselves and each other and laughing at what old fogies we appeared to be to the young women with whom we were arguing, and yet we absolutely were not going to surrender our position. And it's always been so interesting to me that Paula, who had such high academic standards for herself and for others, never lost her fierceness. She never saw it as in conflict with who she was as a historian. She could deplore sloppiness and scholarship and teaching in one breath, and in the next breath be talking about some egregious example of sexism that she was fighting against. And I think at a time when women's studies and gender studies have become more and more academic and arcane, Paula's work shows how feminist passion can generate a body of first-rate historical scholarship that comes out of and feeds the demand for justice.
I first met Paula Hyman right here at JTS. I was a senior in college who, having decided to pursue a degree in Jewish history, chose to spend a year here studying as a visiting student. I was writing a senior thesis at the time on a topic in Jewish women's history, and I asked Paula if she'd serve as my advisor. And I remember being thrilled that she agreed, considering that I wasn't even her own student at the time. In later years, I would realize that there was nothing so special about me or my topic that made her say yes, because Paula said yes to almost everything, often when she shouldn't. I came to appreciate over the years just how much she took on, and I always felt that it derived from her determination to fit in absolutely everything that she possibly could. In fact, I remember one time when she told me she was going to give a lecture at a rather isolated Midwestern American city, and I said, why on earth are you going there? To which she replied, "I've never been to that state before." She seemed to want to go everywhere, see everything, be involved in everything that piqued her interest or that she felt in some way connected to. And probably more than most people, she succeeded. We're here this afternoon to remember Paula for reasons we all know well, as a pioneering feminist scholar, a champion of women's rights in Judaism and within the academy, and a person deeply devoted to her community, her friends, her family, and her students. Here at JTS, of course, she holds special memories as the first woman to have served as dean of any one of the JTS schools. And I would add just one in a litany of firsts throughout her career, including being the first woman to chair the Judaic Studies program at Yale, the first woman to assume the presidency of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and the list goes on and on. Probably everyone sitting in this room has a special memory of Paula, and I knew her for a shorter time than many, if not most of you. So rather than recount her many accomplishments, which we all know, or even share some more personal moments, I want to take the time that I have today to talk about Paula as a teacher and a mentor. By the time I met her, she was already well known and well established as both a feminist activist and a leading scholar. But as I said, when I was nothing more than a senior in college, she was engaged and interested. We got to know each other when I stayed on here to do a master's degree, and of course when I later followed her to Yale as her first student there. I told the story at the AJS Memorial of how vividly I can recall sitting not far from here outside her office and rehearsing in my mind what I would say to convince her to take me on as a student at Yale, which luckily she did. And it was only much later that I found out how far she went to make that happen. To say that having Paula as my mentor was a turning point for me is a vast understatement. I say with absolute certainty, there's simply no chance I would have made it without her. There were things I learned from Paula just by watching how she carried herself. When she started at Yale, she was wearing a wig, she was bloated from medication, and she came into that tough environment as a new faculty member. She just went about her business. I know even better now than I did then, as someone who now teaches at an Ivy League institution, that these are not easy places to navigate as a woman in the best of circumstances. And she did it with tremendous obstacles and with a unique combination of grace and power. She spent most of her life working in, let's say, challenging institutions. First at Columbia, and yes, I must say, here at JTS, and then at Yale. Paula was a warm and generous mentor who combined impeccably high standards with genuine compassion. She understood and actually cared about the personal issues of her students and made it easy to share them with her. But she didn't suffer fools lightly or tolerate excuses. The phrase role model is thrown out so casually that it sometimes ceases to lose its meaning. But that is what she really was in the truest sense of the term, and not by preaching, although there were a few moments of that, but by how she lived and worked. We know how her feminism broke down barriers in Jewish life and in the academy, but it also impacted the way that she treated people on a daily basis. She listened, she collaborated, she empowered the people around her. As a teacher, she cared less about broadcasting her own voice than about cultivating the voices of her graduate students. You know, I belong to a generation that did not pioneer, but rather benefited from the battles fought by Paula and her cohort of feminists. With, I hope, no offense to the other members of that cohort in the room today, I've often found that there are two kinds of feminist pioneers. Those who constantly remind us of how much harder it was for them than for us, which it certainly was, and those who are far more interested in focusing on making things even better for those who come next. And Paula was most decidedly in that latter category. And that's what she tried to do for me from the time that I met her as a senior in college until the last time we spoke. I always knew that Paula was in my corner, even when she disagreed with my decisions. Like when I declined my first job offer, a tenure-track job offer, while still in graduate school. It took me several years after that to get another tenure-track offer. Hard years, but she never brought it up, not ever. Even as she wrote countless letters of recommendation for me in the years that followed. The time that she was probably the most upset with me came when she thought I wasn't standing up for myself as a young female scholar. I was in my first year teaching at Penn, and in a lecture course on modern Jewish history, I was assigned a kind of hanger-on 8th or 9th year graduate student as a teaching assistant. This meant that this male graduate student and I were about the same age, and there were constant struggles over issues of gender and power. In a conversation with Paula, I was complaining about how this TA, who was an historian of Germany, sat in the front row and opened a newspaper while I was lecturing about German Jewry. I was commenting on what a jerk this person was, but Paula went into a long tirade about how I could never tolerate that kind of behavior. I had to stand up for myself. This is my first year. I had to assert my authority with this guy and not allow a kind of pattern like this to be established about how I carried myself. And of course she was right. Paula knew how to be tough when it was necessary. She taught me that too. The other side of that coin is that she was a person of immense kindness. Professionally, her support of me was unqualified. We wouldn't have time today for me to list all of the things that she did for me over the years, and I'm pretty sure there are a good many I'll never know about. Still, even when I called for purely professional reasons, she always wanted to know what else was going on in my life. When I became ill and was struggling to teach and work through it, something which Paula knew a great deal about, I could count on regular phone calls from her to check on me, to see how I was doing. I've always found it, and here I'm reiterating something that's been said a couple of times, I've always found it very difficult to separate Paula's scholarship from who she was as a person. I always thought that she integrated the various facets of her life more seamlessly than most. She was a social historian who focused on the lives of ordinary Jews, paying attention to groups previously ignored and invisible in Jewish historical scholarship, including women. Her scholarship on gender mirrored her feminist activities in the Jewish community, where she also sought to give women a voice. And I would say even her family life, which was clearly always the most important thing to her, was never something isolated from her professional work. She made a point to talk to students and younger colleagues about the challenges of balancing work and family, and all of Paula's students heard about Adina and Judith as they were growing up, maybe more than you would have liked, but we all knew all about your lives. It always seemed to me that the different pieces of her life fit together in quite a remarkable way. In writing about Paula for Lilith magazine, I said that if I were to have to choose one adjective to describe her, I chose a word you used, fierce. Fierce in her passion for family and friends, fierce in her personal, professional, and communal commitments, fierce in the standards she set, and fierce in her unwavering support of the people and the causes that she held dear. When she believed in something, she was unshakable. I know that as I am here talking about Paula, I'm just so one of very many people whose lives she's touched and changed and could easily be here telling their own stories. After she died, the Jewish Women's Archive posted a piece that a young woman, a high school student, had written about how much Paula inspired her. And as far as I could tell, she'd never met her. That's a legacy. There's an immense void after Paula's death, but she left so much of herself here with us. And yes, part of that is a corpus of brilliant and trailblazing scholarship, but it's also reflected in all the people whose lives she touched. And I feel blessed to count myself as one of them. Thanks.
I've been asked by Ann Lerner to moderate, but first, Beth and Judith, would you like to, I don't know what moderating you two would mean, but would there be things that you would like to say to each other at this point? Publicly. In that case, stay here, though. Don't leave yet. And we have about 10 minutes. If there are people here in the audience who'd like to add a couple of words to everything that that's been said. Blue Greenberg. I see your eyes. Would you like to come up in the front, or? Yeah, come up in the front, Blue.
Reflection from an Orthodox woman. Paula had a great impact on Orthodox women, largely through her writings and her scholarship, and I am one of them. But I want to just tell two stories, personal stories. About 20 years ago, Yitz was invited to speak at the 92nd Street Y, and Paula was the moderator or responder, and we went out for dinner together, and that was a time of resurgence of her cancer. And I was being empathetic, and Paula said to me, I don't feel sorry for myself. She said, in fact, she said, there is no place in the world that I would rather be than where I am right now. And that was her unbelievable attitude towards life in terms of her family, her work at Yale, her scholarship, and it was just a life-affirming Paula all of her life. The second is a story of how another way in which she impacted on my life. She was on the committee of the planning the conference at the McAlpin that Judith spoke of. And just by, I think, a fluke, I was invited to give the keynote address, and I was a neophyte. And I didn't realize until later that Paula actually changed my life, because that conference changed my life, or giving that talk changed my life and my career path. And I thought about it afterwards, that Paula was the person who should have given the keynote address. She had written, she was well known, she had done the scholarship, the foundation scholarship, but she had the ability to step aside and give room to a neophyte, and for that I was always very grateful to her. And I might add that Judith Plaskow and Arlene Agus were also on the committee and also stepped aside to make room for new voices. So as Beth spoke this afternoon, about Paula making room for other people, I am one of the beneficiaries of her generosity as well.
I think Deborah had her hand first, and then we'll, okay, or come. Here.
I'm Soja Michelle, one of the co-conspirators in the Jewish Women in America, and it was very gratifying to hear two gentlemen speak who are eminent in the field of Jewish studies, to speak so generously and approvingly of it, because I don't think we were quite sure that we were going to receive that kind of reception at the time we were writing. And I knew that Paula felt very anxious about taking time from her graduate training, because she was in graduate school when we were writing it. But I actually didn't know the part that I didn't know she really gave her. She anticipated the trouble. And we kept saying, oh, Paula, that couldn't possibly happen. Well, obviously it did. So I feel a little guilty having put her in that position, but the way you framed it made me feel much better about it. In any case, it was wonderful to work with her. She was a fantastic scholar. We were all peers. Charlotte and I were, actually we were older. We are older than then Paula, and actually Charlotte would be here today too, but she was unable to make it. But Paula somehow, even though she was younger and we had children and we were more advanced in our sort of life cycle, she made herself a mentor to us in a way. I mean, she didn't really, I don't think she self-consciously took that position, but we just respected her wisdom, her knowledge, her brilliance, and her scholarship so well, so much. I mean, it really gave the book a kind of rigor that it might not have otherwise had. I mean, Charlotte was had been a cookbook editor and was an editor, a literary editor, and went on to become an agent, a literary agent, and I actually went on to get a PhD in American Studies, but at that time I was really just beginning in my own academic career. And Paula really insisted on the rigor and brought so much scholarship and wisdom to the book, so it really made it a much better project than it might have otherwise been. But I think the other thing I want to say is that in getting to know Paula, I was raised in a very assimilated family. I think Charlotte was even more secular than I was. But what I learned from Paula was a respect for her religious background, and I really understood the ordeal that she was going through in challenging it. But I also envied her in a way because she had all that religious training. She knew Yiddish, she knew Hebrew, she knew French, she knew many languages, and she worked so comfortably in with all of those languages. And she knew the Jewish tradition, she knew Jewish history, she knew Jewish theology in ways that Charlotte and I didn't, and we really developed a great respect for her and for that background, and I really envied it in her. So I think even though the book was challenging all of that in many different ways, we couldn't have done it if we didn't have that grounding, if we didn't have Paula's intimate knowledge of it to begin with. So I just wanted to share that with you. And it was in many ways, I moved on to do other kinds of things, other kinds of scholarship, but of course that was my beginning, and it never counted for my tenure either, but, but it was an invaluable experience. Thank you.
We'll do Francine and Deborah, and then if one of you wants to speak from the family, and then I'll introduce Anne. I think just time constraints, Francine.
I'm Francine Klagsbrun. This will be very brief. I got involved in the whole Jewish feminist movement, particularly when the seminary was struggling with the question of ordaining women as rabbis. And Gerson Cohn was the chancellor at that time. And Gerson Cohn began by being very opposed to the whole idea. It changed over time. And one of the reasons it changed, I always felt, and I know Paula did, was he adored Paula. He thought she was brilliant, and he was no great feminist, so she was to him what a woman should be who was a scholar. He didn't see many others like that, blah, blah. But he really, but he adored her. And she, I really felt, and I say she and I together, but she particularly, I believe, swayed him and changed his opinion in terms of women rabbis. He became a great, as many of you know who were involved in the struggle, he became a great advocate for women rabbis toward the end. I used to speak to him a lot, and Paula used to speak to him a lot, and I think that she made a great difference in that sphere.
So I want to echo something that has already been said, which was the way in which Paula treated a whole range of people and had an impact on their lives without, I think, realizing it. And so before I was coming to this event, I was contacted by a woman named Harriet Feinberg, who was one of the many women who worked on the encyclopedia, the Jewish Women's in America, an historical encyclopedia. And we had hundreds of people involved with that. And she couldn't make it here. She's not all that well. But she wanted to be here in spirit. And so she sent me a poem that she had written at the time when the encyclopedia came out. And I want to read you the poem. It's called Women's Encyclopedia. Jumping out of oblivion, the women hurl bricks and songs at page passers-by. They want to be extricated. Their hair is festooned with capital letters and asterisks. Shell slender, they sway, invoking the princess of the printing press. recall her to life. They cry, codify us, alphabetize us, restore us, reduce, retrieve, revamp, restructure us, record us into simple 500-word, 250-word accounts. So we can sit in our print condos, layer on layer, hang out knotted sheet ropes to shimmy from window to window, climbing from C to D, zipping in for a visit, whispering in our cubicles across the generations. Oh, restore. Oh, store on CD-ROM. Oh, acres of communicating 3D women, their dwellings lightly linked with sky glue. What subversive tendencies might emerge?
I'm looking to, okay, Judith, say a couple of words and then I'll introduce you.
I didn't prepare anything to say today. I feel like I've had many opportunities to speak about my mom in the last year, but I inherited my mom's inability to pass up the opportunity to say something. So in addition to this being a day to remember my mom, yesterday was actually the last day for us to say Kaddish for her. And one of the things that I'm realizing is I sort of expected as this year came to a close that there would be some sense of closure. And that actually I think the sense of loss becomes all the more palpable as we exit this first year and realize that life continues without her. In the past year, I find that at least once a week I pick up the phone to ask her a work-related question before I realize that I can't do that. But one of the blessings of my mom, it was not always a blessing when she was alive, but it's a blessing now, is that she had a very loud and insistent voice, and it stays with me, and I suspect with many other people. And she was very consistent in her responses to things, so not often that surprising in what she would say. And so I found that that's very deeply ingrained within me. So even when I can't actually initiate that call, I find that her words are with me very often at work, in my sleep. She yells at me sometimes, and throughout the day. And so I hope that that will continue to be the case for me and for the many other people who she was engaged in lifelong conversation with.
Stan.
So, Judith, you think you got it from your mother, huh? I want to thank all the people who are here, Arnie and David and Ismar, and there's a whole crowd of friends, many of you from long ago, many of you from long, long ago, some of you from ridiculously long ago. There's one person who's not here. We've listened to you all do a study of a person embedded in a social structure. You've analyzed the person, you've analyzed the social structure, how it relates with women, with Judaism, with history. You haven't made any boundaries between what's real professional history and what's individual history. Talked about your own personal experiences as professional historians. You haven't made any boundaries between Judaism and history. I don't even think you've made a boundary between history for women and history for all people. You've studied it as a whole. You've studied it as the whole within a person. Paula studied that with various people. Purakovsky was one of her candidates for study. But you all today have done the same thing. You've done a perfect study of that. And the person who's not here, who would have appreciated this, who went to sessions such as this, who in a sense was an aficionado of funerals and memorials. And I don't mean that in a bad sense. It wasn't a ghoulish sense. It was the social psychology, the social analysis of a person embedded in society. That person is the person you were talking about. So the person that I know who would have appreciated today the most, and not from a selfish sense, and not from a personal glory sense, the person I know who would have appreciated today the most, you all thinking of her, is the person you were talking about. So for her, I say thank you.
person who played the key role in organizing today and who will be very, very involved in helping to perpetuate in a more formal way Paula's legacy is Ann Lapidus Lerner. Ann, of course, professor here at the seminary who taught for many, many years Hebrew literature, but at Radcliffe, Harvard Graduate School, and really back to Boston Latin School. The relationship between the Lapidus and the Hyman families are just intertwined. So it's with great pleasure that I call Ann up to offer her own words and conclude our day today.
First, a few personal memories. Thank you, David, for alluding to the intertwinedness. I remember when I first heard Paula's name. I don't remember the exact day or the exact year, but I do remember the circumstances. My mother, Lillian Green Lapidus, taught history at Girls Latin School and had the pleasure of teaching not only Paula, but also her sisters, Toby and Merle, who are here today. She had to take off all the Jewish holidays, and particularly in the fall, that became a burden on the other members of the history department. So one year she had this great, brilliant idea. Instead of imposing on them, because she couldn't really pay them back on Christmas, school is closed, she decided to ask the brightest student in each class to run the discussion. All right. She was really surprised. She must have been looking at Paula and noticing her sort of white blonde hair, and not so much focusing on her name. When she asked Paula to please help her out in her absence on all those days that kept recurring in the fall, and Paula said that she would be absent too, and Ema came home to tell us how like she'd totally blown that idea. That's why I heard her name. But when I think of Paula now, I think of her smile. I think of the sense of integrity that pervaded all the aspects of her life and her loyalty to those she held dear. Paula's range as a scholar, her path-breaking work in modern Jewish history across settings ranging from the US to France to Central Europe to Eastern Europe, and her devotion as a mentor, all of that has already been discussed and acknowledged here today, as has her activism on behalf of many causes, particularly Jewish feminism, an activism that also was propelled by her sense of integrity. She often enriched and prodded my thinking on issues personal and intellectual, religious and global, encouraging me just to look at things a little bit differently. But there was also her sense of fun. I remember this summer when we decided that our daughters, who had pretty much outgrown the Ramah day camp, needed to go there in order for us to have time free to do our work. And so we cut them a deal. The deal was that instead of going 5 days a week, they would only have to go 4. And the other day, we would take them somewhere. I think we owe you ladies a couple of days, incidentally. And the one I remember was the trip to Six Flags. And when I was there, what really impressed me was 2 things. One was that Paula's risk-taking extended well beyond the scholarly and the activist. And that she didn't push me on rides beyond my comfort zone, which is very narrow. One December 24th, we took our children, her daughters and my son and daughter, to the F.A.O. Schwartz Museum. We told them that just, regardless of all those cash registers, they should just conceive of it as a museum because we were committed to not buying anything. And we succeeded. They had fun. We bought nothing. It was a great outing. And although I know we would be voting the same way this election season and all the ones that preceded it, I miss the opportunity to analyze the scene together, as well as to look at so many issues that confront our beloved state of Israel. So I want to join the chorus of thank yous. I want to thank everyone who came today. You know, we did consider rescheduling, but unlike Mayor Bloomberg, we were not swayed. Because today is the right day. It's the right day because, as Judith mentioned, it marks the end of a certain kind of mourning, not the end of mourning, and doesn't fill in the void. But it does mark a stage in our mourning process. But it also is connected to happy days. Judith's birthday was Monday, Adina's birthday was yesterday, and so it has a positive resonance as well. But finally, it's a day that's sadly linked to Paula's great love of Israel, because it is the 17th anniversary on the secular calendar of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. So I want to thank also particularly, it's a great relief to be able to use people's first names, Arnie and David for their personal involvement in shaping and supporting this program. Jean Bloch-Rosensaft, Assistant Vice President for Communications and Public Affairs at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. We felt that we had a real collaboration between the two institutions. Michelle Giovanello, whose title is Executive Assistant to the Chancellor at JTS, but she put herself out for this program in a manner that's just amazing. Professor Aryeh Davidson of our Education Department, who was my partner in crime in terms of organizing the program. Ilana Cohen, a student here who served as conference coordinator. The new media, facilities, communications, and food service staffs here at JTS all really went above and beyond. And thank you, Siobhan, for coming in on such a tough day. Lilith Magazine for providing some copies of the issue, which has that special section of memories of Paula. And of course, above all, the family members who made the trip from various different directions and all came together to share with us. In order to bring Paula's presence, her deep intelligence, and her clarity of vision into our midst, we're about to screen an excerpt from an address entitled Jewish Identity on the Global Frontier that Paula gave when she was awarded an honorary degree at Hebrew Union College. This is the closing portion of her talk that opened with her characteristically setting the current issue of the impact of globalization on Judaism within, of course, its historical context.
Judaism and expressions of Jewish culture provide meaning in our lives and link us with family and with history. Like many turning points, this period of globalization provides opportunities along with its challenges. The technological advances that accompany globalization may even allow Jews to create a truly transnational community, a community that spans national borders. Of course, Jews are probably the oldest transnational group. Our diaspora has always been far-flung. Its center, the land of Israel, for most of our history, existed only in the imagination and the liturgy of those who looked to Zion. It was necessary, however, for Jews in various communities in the diaspora to connect, however sporadically, with each other. In the past, rabbinic elites performed the function of binding together Jews from disparate places, writing in their common language, Hebrew, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we all had that common language? Sephardi and Ashkenazi rabbis read each other's work and consulted each other on truly vexing halachic problems. The Shulchan Aruch, the 16th century code of Jewish law that remains authoritative, was compiled by a Sephardi Jew, Joseph Caro, who traveled around the Mediterranean, and glossed by an Ashkenazi halachic authority, Moses Isserles, who lived in Poland. Jewish communal institutions and their leaders were also another source of interconnectedness. They were able to blend the local and the distant, even before modern transport made face-to-face contact more and more feasible. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Jewish organizations and their lay leaders built educational institutions for Jews who had no access to modern schooling and provided massive philanthropic assistance to Jews in need throughout the world. Think only of the network of schools established in North Africa, the Balkans, and the Ottoman Empire by the Alliance Israélite Universelle based in France, and the relief efforts of the American Joint Distribution Committee to the war-ravaged Jewish communities of Europe after the First World War. By the turn of the 20th century, Jewish women also became involved with their own organizations, like the National Council of Jewish Women, in social welfare work and political activity that transcended national boundaries. Globalization provides you, our educators and communal leaders, whom we honor specifically today, as well as our rabbis and cantors who recently graduated, the tools to make a difference not only locally, but also transnationally. As you embark on your careers, we hope that you will pay close attention to the local, but also help the members of your communities to take their place in the Jewish world globally conceived. As a result of the system of globalization, the potential connections of Jews throughout the world are no longer limited to rabbinic elites. This is not a direct insult to the rabbinic elites, but simply a broadening of possibilities for other Jews. It's not limited to rabbinic elites or to communal leaders. American Jews can now communicate in real time with Jews in Israel or in France or New Zealand. We can find out about each other in internet chat rooms and discuss issues of common concern. The richness of our Jewish cultures can only be enhanced by these contacts. But globalization compels all of us to ask about the meanings and boundaries of Jewish identity. There are more options available in our own time than in the past, and the debates about identity have high stakes. So I have a number of questions for all of us to consider, and I'm not going to provide any answers. How relevant are boundaries in a world which is seeking in many ways to erase them? Will globalization, which privileges the prosperous members of advanced industrial societies like our own, force us to balance our identities as Jews and as middle and upper class Americans more explicitly than we now do? Are different aspects of our identity mutually exclusive? This is one that we've been grappling with for at least 200 years. Finally, do the self-declared half-Jews with whom I began this talk portend a disturbing wave of the future, or represent a way to honor different parts of our personal heritages? What does it mean that they meet at Brown University's Hillel? Each period of change brings potential for benefit and anxiety about the unfamiliar. Based on what we know about the past, all we can say is that it is likely that American Jewish identity in the next 50 years will be different than it is now. But as historians have repeatedly demonstrated, we are not merely the objects of historical forces beyond our control. We can choose how we react even to anonymous and intimidating trends like globalization. And we can shape identities that give full expression to our values as Jews. Thank you.
We at HUC and at JTS are committed to extending Paula's legacy by strengthening the enterprise of Jewish feminist scholarship, or as Beth said, by continuing to make things better. In many ways, Paula was there at the beginning, as you've heard, helping to promote an agenda that opened the way for an ever wider and deeper understanding of the Jewish experience and cultures by using as one of her tools a feminist lens. One of the goals for this event, proposed by both Chancellor Eisen and President Ellenson, is that it present an ongoing project that reflects Paula's interests and her achievements. We've decided to revive the Jewish Feminist Research Group and to link it with Paula's name, and of course with her memory. The JFRG, the Jewish Feminist Research Group, was started at Ma'ayan at the JCC of Manhattan 15 years ago, right? Eve Landau is here. She was here at the beginning. And it was transferred to JTS's Jewish Women's Studies program in 2002. It is a venue that celebrated both the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women, which Paula edited with Dalia Ofer, and the publication of Pua Rakowski's memoirs. And I want to thank Deborah Dash-Moore, who made the long trip here from Michigan today, for having suggested both of those events to me. Its major focus, however, has been providing a forum in which scholars, nascent and established, independent and affiliated, and graduate students can present works in progress which bring the insights of feminist scholarship to bear on Jewish studies. Papers are circulated in advance, and each presentation is followed by 2 responses by senior scholars before opening the discussion to all present. The group really has provided an ideal setting for testing material for publication, a supportive setting in which one can get honest critique in a supportive way, and I think that very much reflects the way that Paula herself evaluated, helped, supported, helped develop scholarship. And I can give you a taste. I just want a couple of different presentations and from the past. For example, Vanessa Oakes presented something on an anthropological study of the Jewish wedding booklet. Judith Plasko, Decentering Sex, Rethinking Jewish Sexual Ethics. Jill Salberg, The Power of Narrative Stories of Women and Women's Stories. This actually eventually evolved into her keynote at the Freud's Jewish World Conference. Chava Weissler, Gender and Jewish Renewal, Sociology, Liturgy, and Theology. On and on. One more recent, Shira Cohn, The World is Not Ready for This, Jewish Sororities and the Desegregation Question. A lot of these papers are from scholars who had already earned their doctorates, but we also have had over the years opportunities to encourage more junior scholars working on their dissertation, presenting master's essays, working on articles. And we'd like to be able to strike a balance, more established and younger scholars, the latter being of particular interest. I've had the opportunity to have initial conversations with colleagues at Columbia, at Barnard, at NYU, at HUC, and of course here at JTS, about expanding the scope, establishing an advisory committee, and so on. I plan to continue to contact other academic institutions, Yale, Rutgers, Yeshiva University, and Penn, among others. And some additional ideas we had in terms of expanding the scope to include undergraduates who often do wonderful honors theses, and we want to encourage them to go on in Jewish scholarship, mentoring. We want to offer a stipend to respondents as well, and perhaps to mentors. dissertation writing groups, help with turning the dissertation into the book, which is often a hurdle for young scholars, prizes for outstanding work, and of course research grants. We've been given seed money by HUC and JTS, and I'm very grateful for their providing the opportunity to embark on this project. For me, a phrase that sums up Paula's work, which will, I hope, be reflected in this project, is Binu Shnot Dor Vador. Understand the years of each generation, from Deuteronomy 32. It reflects the special qualities of Binah, knowledge and understanding informed by experience. It teaches us that each generation has its own situation that needs to be explored in its own contexts. Just as that specific Binah informs our understanding of the past, so should it inspire the scholars of the future, each in her or his own way. We hope that we can turn to you for your advice, guidance, support in making this project a true reflection of the life and work of this remarkable woman, our remarkable friend. And we conclude most fittingly by asking Judith Rosenbaum to lead us in some of the Hebrew songs that were so special to Paula, after which, 2 pieces of instruction. Number 1, there will be a reception to follow in the Alpern lobby, which is 1 flight down, and people will help you find the way. Number 2, if you have a coat here, take it with you. There's another coat rack outside Alpern, and you don't want to come back here. Judith.
So as we've said before, here and in other places, my mother loved Hebrew culture, Israeli culture. She loved Hebrew language, and she loved to sing. She was a very joyful person. And so we picked some songs today that were some of her favorite Hebrew songs, and that reflect. I think she loved these songs in particular because they are both hopeful and also filled with yearning, and I think that was very much part of her spirit. I'm going to not lead from up here because I think our voices will rise together, but I don't need to be a cantorial soloist.